over the wall of space. We have no choice but to follow it.
The next day, he and Jackie went to Dallas.
From Dallas, Texas, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago.
The assassination of Kennedy was probably the most traumatic thing that occurred to our population since at least Pearl Harbor. There was a lot of hope resting in his presidency that he had not yet realized that suddenly people were denied.
The hopes and dreams Kennedy brought with him to the White House were enhanced by his money, making his presidential legacy grow well beyond his actual accomplishments in office.
The idealism, the commitment to public service, the desire that people should give something of themselves back to America. I think these are some of the most important legacies of the administration.
Only 2 men have been elected president while holding seats in the U.S. Senate: Warren G. Harding and John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy's assassination in Dallas, Texas, on November 22nd, 1963, left the nation in a state of shock and despair. Within hours of the tragedy, Kennedy's vice president was sworn into office aboard Air Force One. Number 36, Lyndon A. Johnson, Democrat, 1963 and 1969, age 55, from Texas.
The greatest leader of our time has been struck down.
The day after the assassination, Johnson pledged to dedicate his presidency to the fulfillment of Kennedy's legacy. How well Johnson actually enacted Kennedy's presidential agenda was another matter. Johnson was not happy about the way he gained the presidency, but once he had it, there was much he wanted to do.
He was just insatiable about being a great politician. He wanted to be the greatest president.
Johnson had risen from poverty to become a hugely powerful politician. He was a larger-than-life character, alternately charismatic and crass.
He was one of the smartest human beings I've ever met. He was cunning. He was kind of like being an animal in the jungle. He didn't read, he wasn't a scholar, but he just was so clever and so aware of people and what they did, and so able to analyze them. And then he had this kind of volcanic personality, up and down. He was on certain days a little.
He had a ego problem as big as his own hat. He felt inferior dealing with all these Ivy League people, and he frequently overreacted to that and pushed these people around just to prove he could do it.
Johnson had an in-your-face management style. At 6'2", he overwhelmed people to get what he wanted. It became known as the Johnson treatment.
The Johnson treatment was getting in people's faces and bullying them, shouting them, bribing them, whatever, to get his own way.
And he didn't know whether it was a gesture of friendship or a gesture of trying to dominate. I think in Johnson it was both.
Besides the treatment, Johnson gained the upper hand by holding meetings in unconventional places. He was skinny dipping in the White House pool when he called for 2 of his aides to come and listen to his Great Society. This was Johnson's vision of America, realizing its true promise: a democracy with freedom and justice for all.
In this vision, it was to raise the underprivileged and the discriminated against to new levels of equality if he could.
Johnson's Great Society resulted in an explosion of new laws: the Voting Rights Act, Medicaid, federal aid for education, environmental protection law, food stamps, Head Start, National Public Radio, the public broadcasting system, consumer protection laws, and the Civil Rights Act.
No president wanted to do forever. Civil rights was absolutely core of his commitment to society. Lyndon Johnson is going to go down in history for one reason, and that's for civil rights.
Johnson also expanded on Kennedy's efforts to fight a war on poverty, and he succeeded, eventually cutting the percentage of those who lived in poverty by half. Winning the war in Vietnam, however, was another matter. In June 1965, General William Westmoreland warned Johnson that he risked losing the war unless he mobilized the reserves, committed more firepower, and doubled the troops from 65,000 to 125,000. Johnson authorized sending 100,000 more troops, but even then, America came no closer.
How could it be that these Vietnamese guerrillas, these guys running around the jungles of black could stand up to American military power, to our superior firepower and technology? Is he politically connected to reality?
At home, the anti-war movement gained momentum. What had started as Truman's containment policy was now Johnson's war.
I spoke to Mr. Johnson about this, and she said that he heard those protesters marching up and down in front of the White House, yelling, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" And it was a wound in his heart. He suffered terribly, she said, over the fact that so many boys were dying.
The enemy of freedom has chosen to make this year the decisive one.
The last year of Johnson's presidency began with the devastating Tet Offensive. The bold North Vietnamese advance on Saigon made victory look remote, perhaps impossible. At home, Johnson faced opposition within his own party from Robert Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy. Under fire, Johnson decided not to run for re-election.
I shall not cease, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Lyndon Johnson, tragic, because no man fell from a higher pinnacle, and no man sought or not to be more president.
At the end of his term, Johnson tried to negotiate peace with Vietnam, but failed.
I think Johnson's reputation will make a comeback. I think he will be seen as if not be a great president, but pretty darn close to it. Because in the domestic realm, there was no president other than Franklin Roosevelt who achieved war than LBJ. I think in time, as this Vietnam issue fades somewhat, he'll be seen, I think, as a more effective president than he's been seen in recent years.
Johnson liked the salt drink Fresca so much that he had a soda fountain installed in the Oval Office that dispensed only Fresca. Richard Nixon had spent the better part of his lengthy political career scheming and campaigning for the president. In 1968, he ran on a platform that included what he called a secret plan to end the war in Vietnam. In truth, Nixon wanted to keep the war going.
The last thing he wanted was for the Democrats to gain a signal diplomatic victory in October surprise. And so he led on to a couple of committees that if they could hold on, that they could hope for something better for Richard Nixon.
It was the first of many illicit acts that would ultimately lead to the most shameful presidential downfall in history. Number 37, Richard M. Nixon, Republican, 1969 to 1974, 56 years old, from California. Nixon was one of the most experienced politicians of the 20th century. He'd been a congressman, U.S. senator, and vice president. But by the time he finally became president, he had also accumulated many enemies.
Nixon always kept lists of enemies, and he really saw the presidency in large part as a vehicle for punishing his enemies and rewarding his friends and for promoting his own image.
He had within him demons, personal demons, that he really could not control. He had 14 resentment against his enemies, and enemies were everywhere.
Nixon's paranoia was rooted in deep insecurity. Ambitious to a fault, he harbored a desperate need to prove himself and rise above his middle-class origin. Nixon's personality reflected his management style. He was obsessed with power and had to be in control at all times. Nixon bypassed Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense so that he and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, could control foreign policy.
Nixon wanted to run foreign policy out of the White House, and partly he wanted to do so because he was smarter about foreign policy, but partly because he wanted to do it in a secretive fashion.
Publicly, Nixon endorsed a plan to end America's involvement in Vietnam. Privately, Nixon escalated the war effort by bombing Cambodia and sending the Marines to invade Laos. In May 1969, when the New York Times revealed the secret bombing, Nixon went ballistic. He ordered wide-scale wiretapping of government officials and journalists to try and trace the leak.
This was really the beginning of the in-house wiretapping in the Nixon administration. Arguably, giving up water, as we understand sort of all of the secret illegal doings that Nixon and Kissinger and others participated in.
While Nixon and Kissinger had surreptitiously intensified the conflict in Vietnam, they also pursued a radical new plan to end it.
Architecture that Nixon and Kissinger come up with is what's called a triangular diplomacy, in which we disengage from Vietnam while playing Russia and China off against each other.
Nixon understood that the key to peace in Vietnam was a good relationship with China, Vietnam's ally. Toward this, he forged a diplomatic relationship with the Chinese, then brokered an agreement with Hanoi in January 1973.
That we today have concluded an agreement to end the war and bring peace with honor in Vietnam.
He saw that was really the only way he could ultimately pull out of Vietnam. He also saw this as an opportunity to exert leverage on the Soviet Union. And he very effectively sort of played both sides of the fence, even as he was making overtures to China. He was also talking with Brezhnev about starting to improve relations.
Nixon's visit to China in February 1972, followed by the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty with the Soviets in May, were the crowning achievements of his presidency. These diplomatic breakthroughs with the communist world secured Nixon's landslide re-election later that year. It also led to an official ceasefire in Vietnam. In January 1973, North Vietnam and South Vietnam agreed to stop fighting. But secretly, and without the consent of Congress, Nixon promised the president of South Vietnam that the U.S. would restart bombing North Vietnam if Hanoi violated the accord. Simultaneously, in 1973, a political scandal was heating up. Watergate.
Nixon's wiretapping of reporters, the infiltration of the student, the infiltration of the Black Panther, the possible overthrow of the Chilean government. All these things were hanging around like fireflies on a summer night when the Watergate story hit.
Nixon fought the inevitable for 2 torturous years, believing that he, as president, was somehow above the law.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I burned everything I've got.
In July 1974, after 14 months of congressional hearings on Watergate, the House Judiciary Committee passed an article of impeachment charging Nixon with obstruction of justice. But before the House could vote to impeach, Nixon resigned on August 9th.
I shall resign the presidency of tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president.
He was angry. He was very angry
at his enemies, but he was also angry at himself. As he looked back, he said, I gave my enemies a sword, and they ran me through.
Nixon's legacy is divided, much like the man himself. On the one hand, he was a brilliant strategist. On the other, he will always be tarnished by war, and he is the only president to resign. After escorting Nixon to their helicopter, Vice President Gerald Ford silently walked back inside the White House and took the oath of office.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over.
Number 38, Gerald Ford, Republican, 1974 to 1977, 61 years old, from Michigan. As Jerry Ford stepped into the White House, he walked into a house of turmoil. Ford faced the still pending criminal indictment of Nixon, an America which felt betrayed by Washington, and a Congress eager to reclaim power they felt had been usurped. If anyone had the ability to heal the nation after Nixon's resignation, it was Jerry Ford. He was open and honest, with a history of consensus building.
Our country sometimes has a magical ability of coming up with the right person for the time. And after Richard Nixon, we really need a Gerald Ford.
Careful that wasn't when he heard about the Nixon enemies list. Any man who has to keep a list or remember his enemies has got too many enemies.
Right away, Ford became frustrated with his inability to preside over the business of the nation.
Are you saying, sir, that option pardon former President Nixon?
He was spending upwards of half his time dealing with issues relating to Watergate.
I make the final decision. And he said at some point, we gotta cut this off. I've got to govern, we gotta deal with inflation, we gotta deal with Vietnam, we gotta deal with the Soviets, we got big issues out here. So I said, I'm gonna cut it. Boom, the party. I, Gerald R. Ford, do grant a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
He is correct that he would have assumed his presidency, but it was lack of consultation, lack of preparation, lack of a sense that he had not built enough legitimacy himself to be able to make that determination.
Compounding the fragile political situation, North Vietnam broke the peace accord and launched an offensive into South Vietnam. Ford requested military and economic aid to help the South Vietnamese, but Congress refused.
Zilch. The Congress wouldn't give any more aid. They had had enough.
The Congress, knowing nothing of the private commitments made between Kissinger and Nixon to President II, just pulled the plug on Vietnam and unleashed one of the great terrors on Vietnam.
On April 19, 1975, Saigon fell to the Communists.
There's certain things that will be seared in our collective memories of presidencies. A helicopter from the sea is one of those. We were evacuated. And people thought we would lose our credibility. People thought it would be the end of America's influence in the world.
As much as Ford struggled to prevent that outcome, he didn't have the support of the nation behind him. Only with time has history been able to look back at Ford's presidency and see, without the emotion of Watergate, what he accomplished.
He has to keep his legacy. But I really wanted to leave my country better than I found. And he did.
In the 1976 election, Americans wanted to get Watergate and Vietnam behind them, and they would turn to a true Washington outsider as the next occupant of the White House. Inaugural parade route from the Capitol to the White House, just as Thomas Jefferson had done in 1801.
It was a wonderful political gesture at the inauguration because it demonstrated what the president should always demonstrate, and that's humility.
Carter's family was always a visible part of the president. Daughter Amy had her own treehouse on the White House grounds. Hard-drinking brother Billy made headlines picking Billy beer. Jimmy Carter enjoyed softball and jogging. He was a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and served in the pioneering nuclear submarine program. He was tenacious, virtuous, and smart. Raised a Southern Baptist, he was a deeply religious man whose Secret Service code name was Deacon.
He was a man of great faith, a truly good man. He said what he felt. I think he tried to do what was right by his standards, his Christian standards in every instance. That doesn't always work in this city. Carter was seen in Washington as something of a weirdo because people in Washington were not used to presidents with deeply sincere religious beliefs.
And we're going to meet our goal, cut that down 20 minutes. Carter approached the job of president with the same Protestant work ethic that had served him well throughout his life. He micromanaged the White House agenda, spending long hours scouring over briefing books and memos.
Jimmy Carter digested memos like the rest of us do hot dogs or something. He scooped them up and he ate them.
For President Carter, the Oval Office would prove to be a crucible where high ideals were challenged and often withered under the heat of political realities. He found the political games of Washington unsavory, and he mostly refused to play them.
You've got to get along with those politicians. You got to get along with that House. You got to get along with that Senate. And he just didn't do it. He would not play that game.
I thought that Jimmy Carter was someone who was very idealist, wanted to do the right thing, but I felt like he never had the kind of pragmatic political sense that you need in order to negotiate the power centers that you have to negotiate in Washington if you're going to get anything done.
Carter's political reticence handicapped his domestic initiatives, although he did change the face of the presidential cabinet, adding posts for energy and education. It was on the world scene where he truly made his mark. He will go down in history as the president who made human rights central to his foreign policy.
In the past, we had gone to bed with the military dictatorships all over South America, Latin America, and Central America, and so forth. I decided that we should,
Without taking away anything from Carter's diplomatic achievement, the flip side of that coin is a certain naivete about the world. Brutal, harsh, menacing.
In his best moments, Carter's combination of religious idealism with a tenacity of purpose yielded spectacular results. None was more than the 1978 Camp David Accord, which Carter personally broke between President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. Carter took on the role as peacemaker in the Middle East despite strong skepticism from his advisors and the American press.
And all those intelligent reporters and press people said, oh, come on, it's not going to work, Mr. President. You know, not a good idea, et cetera, et cetera. And Carter proved to be right. And we, as usual, proved to be right.
Surely Carter enjoyed defying Washington establishment, but he had a higher purpose in bringing Sadat and Begin to the party.
I've been a ball teacher since I was 18 years old. I got home Bible lessons at the Naval Academy Chapel when I was a midshipman. I knew the geography of the Holy Land. I knew the ancient history of it. So I had an idealistic vision of seeing if I couldn't bring peace between Israel primarily and Egypt and address simultaneously the problems of the Palestinians.
Getting Sadat and Begin to sit down with each other was an achievement in itself, but getting them to agree on it was a challenge of almost biblical proportions.
I found that Begin and Sadat were personally incompatible. The first 3 days, all they did was argue about ancient grievances and made ugly remarks.
There's this extraordinary moment when Bacon blows up and wants to march out of the cabin and leave Maryland, and Carter puts his hands and blocks it, says, "You're not going. I'm not letting you guys leave until we get a peace accord."
It took 13 days, but finally, an exhausted President Carter persuaded Sadat and Begin to agree on a framework for peace. The signing of the Camp David Accords was the high water mark of the Carter years. Within months of that achievement, an energy and economic crisis that had been building throughout the 1970s, Carter's approval rating plummeted.
Does Jimmy Carter deserve the blame for the stagnant economy? Of course not. But did he do anything to improve consumer confidence? No.
There was a perception that this was a good and decent man who was in over his head.
The summer of 1979 gave birth to one of the lasting images of the Carter years: Americans waiting in long lines for gasoline. The crucible was beginning to breathe.
The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
The president intended this 1979 Oval Office address to be a national platform. But opponents famously dubbed Carter's malaise speech.
Everything he was saying was very true. But American people don't want to be scolded if something's going wrong. They don't want to be told they're the cause of it. We hire a president to fix our problems, not to whine about them.
As if the wasn't enough to there, Carter was yet to face the most difficult challenge of his presidency. In October of 1979, Islamic militants stormed the American embassy in Iran, keeping 52 Americans as hostages.
The taking of the hostages was an enormous shock to the country. Seeing the American diplomats paraded blindfolds and all kinds of humiliation was a shock to the American people.
Carter resisted calls for a swift military response, preferring a slow path to diplomacy. It was a decision that reawakened the uneasy feeling among many Americans that he was too weak-kneed to be president. But Carter wasn't about to start dropping bombs just to boost his hold.
My most difficult decision was not using military force against Iran. I could have destroyed Iran, all its oil fields and so forth with a military attack. But I thought that in that process, the hostages would be the danger of the loss. My goal from the very beginning was to bring back every single hostage safe and free.
A failed military rescue effort in April 1980 further weakened the Carter. The 1980 election was held on the one-year anniversary of the taking of the hostages. Amid the avalanche of bad news, Carter lost in a landslide. Talking former actor from California, Ronald Reagan. Carter became obsessed with securing the release of the hostages before his term expired.
What? Oh, what?
Order.
Yeah, my cattle.
As a director of finance, I'm managing 15 and 20 contracts. AI is to summarize long contracts and identify key terms instantly. AI assistant helps me compare two different versions of the same document for changes. It makes me feel very confident that nothing's missing and everything's accurate. With AI assistant, we're able to focus on what really matters. Growing our business and finding new ways to reach out to clients.
In real estate, everything is in the details. Adobe Acrobat helps me confidently manage contracts so I can keep all on the same page. With AI Assistant, I can summarize key details in seconds. And it even identifies differences in contracts. And my client can go straight to Adobe Acrobat and sign right there. Adobe Acrobat and AI Assistant help me focus on what really matters. Helping people find a place that they can call home.
Yoda, America. You're just one flight away from Aotearoa, New Zealand. So pop over and come share this place we call home.
His presidency conducting negotiations for the Oval. It wasn't until Reagan was delivering his inaugural address that Carter was informed of the review.
At the end of the Tehran airport for about 2 hours and a half before that, and just waiting. I think the point to many times.
Some speculate that the positive release was delayed intentionally.
And thank God for answering my 14 months of prayer. I will do that as well. Happy moments in my life. As a no, finally, that helps me.
Carter returned home to Georgia, where he embarked upon a post-presidential career as a peacemaker and international. Returned him a Nobel Prize and universal acclaim. In many ways, the success of the board was crucial on his political.
Anything I learned was to work with others. And you have to have dreams of greatness, and sometimes you can't be completely successful. But it's your possibility, or even the prospects of disappointment deter you. You're setting the highest possible standard of morality and ethics and honesty and decency and peace.
Jimmy Carter is just related to Elvis Presley and June Carter Cash.
All right, quiet on the set.
In 1980, former movie actor Ronald Reagan swept his way to the presidency, beating incumbent Jimmy